Study.
Good morning, and welcome to the College of Behavioral and Community Sciences Fall Colloquium. My name is Julie Surovitz. I'm the Dean of the College. I want to welcome you to this event and thank you for your, once again, and hopefully last, virtual attendance. This is the 6th year of our annual Fall Community Colloquium. Previous topics included mental health, guns, and violence, the opioid epidemic, immigration and policy, and school mental health. This year, we're talking about Tampa Mayor's Community Task Force on Policing. I think you're really going to enjoy this. I want to thank our sponsors, Drs. Carl and Cynthia Hawkins, who have generally supported this event for the last several years. Thank you both so much. We're going to kick off the program with a video welcome from Mayor Jane Castor herself. Mayor Castor is the 59th mayor of the city of Tampa. Born and raised here, Jane has spent a lifetime in service to the community, first as a police officer, then as Tampa's first female chief of police, and is currently the city's mayor. She graduated from Chamberlain High School and attended the University of Tampa on an athletic scholarship. She played basketball. Jane spent 31 years with the police department, serving in every capacity in nearly every neighborhood of the city. In October of 2009, Jane became Tampa's first female chief of police, serving for 6 years in that role. During her time as a senior staff member, Castor worked to reduce major crimes 70% citywide. While chief, she developed and successfully executed a progressive policy strategy during the Republican National Convention and oversaw the successful Bollywood Awards held in America for the first time. In addition, she oversaw the security plan for Super Bowl 43 and led the Department of Homeland Security's Tampa Bay Urban Area Security Initiative. Over to you, Jane.
Neighborhoods and buildings. Welcome you. Hello everyone, Mayor Jane here. I'd like to welcome you to this year's Community Task Force on Policing. The work you're doing here is so important. I can tell you firsthand, community policing is about much more than just walking a beat. I firmly believe that every officer should consider themselves a community police officer. Having our officers out in neighborhoods and building relationships means that young people can see a positive image of our police. Our officers are also safer when they're known and respected. We established the Mayor's Community Task Force on Policing to bring local leaders, activists, and subject matter experts into the conversation. We want to make sure we're hearing from lots of diverse voices when it comes to police reform and social justice. The recommendations for reform here are all based on research. We interviewed families across Tampa and collected data on their perceptions of our officers. That's how we're taking the next steps to address concerns and improve our policies and procedures. I want to thank USF for hosting this important event and all of our task force members. With your help, I know we can continue taking progressive steps forward together.
Thank you so much, Mayor Castor. This is not the first time that the mayor has been an active participant in this colloquium. She's either attended or presented in a number of previous ones, and we always appreciate her support. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today, Dr. Kathleen Heidi. Dr. Heidi holds the rank of Distinguished University Professor of Criminology at the University of South Florida, and that's a big deal. Professor Heidi enjoys teaching both undergraduate and graduate students and is actively engaged in theses and doctoral advising. She is the recipient of 6 awards for teaching excellence, including USF's most prestigious award, the Jerome Koronovic Distinguished Teaching Award. Professor Heidi's publication record includes 4 books and more than 120 other professional publications in the areas of adolescent homicide, parricide, family violence, personality assessment, and juvenile justice. Professor Heidi is the author of 2 widely acclaimed books on juvenile homicide, which are the accumulation of her 25 years of research and clinical evaluation involving parricide victims and offenders. Dr. Heidi's research has also been featured in Newsweek, Psychology Today, U.S. News and World Report, APACA in Brazil, Facts in Switzerland, and dozens of newspapers worldwide, including the New York Times, USA Today, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and Chicago Tribune. Whew. She's appeared in several nationally televised talks and news shows, including Larry King Live, CNN, Good Morning America, Fox News, Court TV, In Session, and 2020. Professor Heidi has served as a consultant to the National Institutes of Justice, National Institutes of Health, many state agencies, and several law firms. I am humbled. Dr. Heidi.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Dean Surovich. It's really my pleasure to be here today participating in this event, which is co-sponsored by the USF Department of Criminology and also by the Department of Mental Health Law and Policy. It's just about 8 months ago when we had our first community conversation on policing in Tampa Bay. Like many of you, I'm one of hundreds of millions of people who watched in horror the 8-minute video of George Floyd taking his last breath in the custody of police. The image of Mr. Floyd lying on his stomach with his hands handcuffed behind his back, with a police officer's knee lodged firmly in his neck, as 3 officers were nearby, is forever etched in my mind. I alternate between anger and sadness as I remember Mr. Floyd repeatedly telling the officers, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe," and calling out for his deceased mother, whom he loved so dearly. Civil rights activist and Congressman Joe Lewis commented on the global outcry in the days following Mr. Floyd's death. He remarked that the protests over another Black man dying in the hands of police seemed different from demonstrations in the past. The protests, in Congressman Lewis's words, were, and I quote, "much more massive and all-inclusive. To see people from all over the world taking to the streets, to the roadways, to stand up, to speak out, to do what I call getting in trouble." And continuing with the congressman's words, "and with a sense of determination and commitment and dedication, there will be no turning back. People now understand what the struggle was all about. It's another step down the very, very long road toward freedom, justice for all humankind." The community conversation on policing held in January 2021 was very good. It started us on the path of having these discussions in our community, bringing together academics, law enforcement practitioners. The event was moderated by USF professor and nationally recognized expert, Dr. Lori Friedel from the Department of Criminology. Participants included Tampa Mayor Jane Castor, Assistant Chief Lee Burkhoff, USF Professor Brianna Fox, Assistant State Attorney Jeria Wiles, and community activist and law student Justin Coffey. And we will post that link in the chat if you didn't see it last January or you would like to see it again. Today's program is a follow-up on that presentation. The presenters today will include law enforcement, researchers, and practitioners. They will address two very important questions. Number one, what has been accomplished in Tampa to improve community and police relations? And two, what initiatives possibly underway might continue to be pursued to promote justice, to ensure fairness, and to foster community and individual safety. We will leave questions for the end after each of the presenters has had a few moments with you, and we encourage you to use the chat function. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, and that is Assistant Chief Lee Burkhoff from the Tampa Police Department. Chief Burkhoff joined the Tampa Police Department in 1997. In the 24 years that he has been with TPD, he has served in a variety of positions in all three districts. He is, and I'm proud to say this, a graduate of the University of South Florida Department of Criminology in two respects. He holds his bachelor's degree in criminology and also his master's in criminal justice administration. Chief Burkhoff is particularly known for his proactive stance in crime reduction and also for his management of large-scale events such as the Super Bowl. He is currently an active member of the Tampa Bay Police Chief Association, and he is currently pursuing his PhD in criminology at St. Leo University. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that Chief Burkhoff was honored at the Criminology Wall of Fame for his achievements and received an award as an outstanding criminology ambassador. So I now turn it over to Chief Burkhoff, and I thank you, Chief, for taking time out of your busy schedule to say a few words today.
Thank you, Dr. And good morning. It is my honor. Let's check some feedback. All right. Can you, Dr. Heidi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Chief.
Yep, we were going to go on this end. So it's my honor to be here with my alma mater for such an important event. And Dr. Heidi, just like you and our participants and every other citizen, our officers were repulsed by the murder of George Floyd. And you all probably think that it didn't affect us as much, but it affected us more because that's somebody that's out there tarnishing our badge and our profession. And it probably had more of an impact on our officers than any of you all could ever realize. And there's probably no words that I could put out there to convey that. but a definite impact on our personnel and law enforcement across the nation. Having these conversations are extremely important to our community and our officers. Going back to the original Peelian principles from Robert Peel, the community are the police and the police are the community. And that's critical, as we can't do our job without the community support. And having conversations like this are instrumental in us getting the feedback from the community. And Dr. Brianna Fox has talked about it before, having what we would call a reverse ride-along, where a police officer goes out in the community with a citizen. And Ray Wong is on here, and we were both in Leadership Tampa together, the greatest class of all time in 2017. But part of that class was reverse ride-alongs. And one of the things I did that was very impactful to me is in an area, I was a major in District 2 at the time in Sulphur Springs. And they put me out with a group of 5 people in what they call a food desert, which is very hard for families to get food. And they gave us money, and they dropped us off and said, here's your money, you go and try to find food for your family and bring it back. It took us 4 hours to figure out how to get to a bus, to get to a grocery store, get the food back, and walk back to the location that we needed back to. Just going through that exercise opened my eyes to some of the challenges that I had heard about but never experienced. And putting myself in that role left a lasting impression on me. And that's one of the things that we're doing with our officers, is getting more opportunities for them to do those reverse ride-alongs themselves. So it was my honor to be a part of Mayor Castor's task force on policing. And what's unique to this, and Dr. Fox, I'm sure we'll talk about it later, is this was a pioneer across the country, as it included community members and police officers and USF leaders and students all coming together and collaborating. And listening to the community in that forum was extremely enlightening for all of our officers. And it was very valuable for us moving forward and evolving our policing. And I think we were visionaries in this. I think the mayor was, and I think USF made a huge, huge impact on us doing this. Our mission statement at the Tampa Police Department has been since 2003 to reduce crime and improve the quality of life with the cooperative partnership with our citizens. And that is the most important part of our mission statement, because we can't do anything without the cooperative partnership. And just listening and getting the data and evidence-based data to move forward from those is critical for us. One of the outcomes that we had in the task force was adopting our core values. And our core values came under the acronym of TRUST. And TRUST stands for transparency, respect, understanding or empathy, safety for the officers and the citizens, and then teamwork of us all working together. And Dr. Brianna Fox and USF were instrumental in that task force. She's done an outstanding job, and we're thrilled to hear about it. I won't steal all of her thunder, but I am extremely excited too, when we get to that point, is for us to talk about our behavioral health advancements, which was finding number 17 in the task force. So we will be here at the end, and we're very excited to answer any questions. And we're looking forward to being a part of this event. Thank you for having us, and thank you, Dr. Hay.
Thank you, Chief. It's a pleasure to have you here as well, and for your leadership in this area. It is my pleasure now to introduce my colleague, Dr. Brianna Fox. Dr. Fox, as Chief Burkhoff said, played a major role, basically a lead role, in the Mayor's Task Force on Policing. She is an associate professor in the Department of Criminology and a faculty affiliate of the Florida Mental Health Institute. Dr. Fox has her PhD from the University of Cambridge and is a former FBI special agent. Her research focuses on evidence-based policing and crime prevention strategies, and the identification of risk factors for criminal behavior and prolific offending. Dr. Fox's research has been featured in high-quality journals in criminology, law, and psychology. She is the founder of the Spruce Lab, which brings together university students to study really real-world problems and to assist the community. And some of the areas that the students have worked with Dr. Fox include solving cold cases and being involved on the front lines in the project of interviewing citizens and police officers about community relations in Tampa and how things can be better. Dr. Fox has won many awards. I am going to limit myself to two. In 2013, Dr. Fox received the Excellence in Law Enforcement Research Award from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. In 2020, Dr. Fox received the USF Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Civic and Community Engagement. Dr. Fox will be discussing the information gathering process that she used directed with her students and the adoption of the 5-pillar model to frame the reports and recommendations made with respect to the Mayor's Task Force on Policing. Welcome to Dr. Fox.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, and thank you, Dr. Heidi, for that very kind introduction. The sheen of that will never grow old, so thank you so much for that. That was very kind of you. It's my pleasure to be here today and to share with everybody some of the work that we were doing collaboratively with the Tampa Police Department, the Task Force on Policing here in Tampa, my colleagues at USF, and other researchers that have been working on these issues around the nation. I think that we were able to do something really important and unique here. As Chief Burkhoff mentioned, I think that we were actually ahead of our time in terms of being able to do some of this right here in Tampa before a lot of other agencies started picking up on it and are now using what we did here in Tampa as a model. I was actually in Washington, D.C. last week, and I was both flattered, but also not too surprised to hear them talking about other agencies that literally refer to it as the Tampa model and discussing what we were doing here in Tampa, how we were implementing these types of changes, and why the others were looking towards us as for a leadership role. So I want to start with overviewing some of the events that occurred and the timeline, just so you have an idea of how all of this took place, what happened, and what we found and where we are at today. So to begin, as I said, we're going to discuss what happened and essentially what did we find, what did we do about it, and where are we now? So this both seems like such a long time ago and yet all too recent in our memory. As Dr. Heidi mentioned, that day watching the news in Minneapolis, I can never get that image, out of my mind. But that's really obviously what really set everything off. And unfortunately, the day that George Floyd died due to the Minneapolis police officer changed our lives forever. Shortly afterwards, we had events here in Tampa in response to this, where people were obviously and warned. They were very upset about it, and obviously there were protests. As you recall, there were some violent protests that occurred here in Tampa. There was a lot of people that were just so upset about what happened and looking towards leadership, looking towards our academic field. What can be done about this? How can we start making things right? So that was May 30th. By early June, Mayor Castor had already begun discussing some new steps that she wanted to take, And that was when she first announced that she was planning to make some changes in the Tampa Police Department, and also started having conversations with me about my participation in perhaps a task force on policing. On June 27th is when we had our first meeting. I remember that all too well. I was asked to attend and to start working with our community members and the police department to understand what was going on, why were people feeling this way, what could we possibly glean from the research and evidence-based policing to help make things better here in Tampa. I was joined by 12 USF graduate students, without whom this would have never been possible, and I just want to emphasize that because they're absolutely outstanding, and I'm going to list their names at the end because they deserve a lot of recognition for all they did, as well as the 40 task force members that participated and were just so essential in helping us understand exactly how people felt here in Tampa about the events that occurred in Minneapolis. Shortly afterwards, we have in August the results of our task force meetings. I can say 8 weeks to go from start to finish when we conducted both qualitative and quantitative assessments, pulling massive amounts of literature together, trying to understand exactly what evidence-based solutions could be used to address the specific concerns raised by people here in Tampa. It was a massive undertaking, and again, I'm going to emphasize the role that both the task force members and my graduate students played in this. So on August 28th, we released the results of our task force findings, and shortly afterwards, Mayor Castor and then Chief Dugan said they were going to implement all of the changes, 100% of them here in Tampa. So that was pretty much our best case scenario of what we wanted to hear, and that was exactly what they said. And it really showed their commitment to not just what we were intending to do, but really showing they were putting it into play. Shortly afterwards, there were additional discussions about how we can actually evaluate the impact of these changes on how people feel about the police department here in Tampa. Then again, I just want to also show the tempo of how fast all of this was occurring. There were some initial discussions from Mayor Castor and Chief Dugan with the police department to make sure that everybody at the police department understood why this was occurring and how this was not just checking the box type of changes. This is about changing the culture, the attitude, the understanding of where we're at today and how to have a lasting impact on police community relations. Shortly after that, we were very fortunate actually to receive quite a bit of community support and support from USF. And my colleague Edelyn Verona and I were able to stand up the first center that specifically aims to address these issues. It's the new USF Center for Justice Research and Policy. And in addition to addressing these exact types of concerns and issues, we're also able to utilize the knowledge and research from practitioners, law enforcement, members of our community, and scholars from a host of different departments, colleges, fields of expertise, all coming together specifically to try to reform and make better our justice system. So thank you again to USF for supporting us in this way. And please, all of you, take a look at our website, which I will share specifically to learn more about what we're doing at the CJRP to continue addressing these types of issues here in Tampa. Shortly afterwards, we had our first citywide assessment where we were specifically updating the members of our task force on what we were doing specifically to implement the changes that were made, but also to get a better understanding of now, almost a year later, where are members of our community at? Are they feeling better, the same, worse? So my graduate students and I started collecting additional data, this time from beyond just our task force members, but actually from the entire city, and trying to understand where people were at with the police and how they felt about the changes that we were implementing. April 27th, we went before City Council and presented our findings and made sure that they understood exactly what was going on with the task force and again our implementation of the findings of the police department. We're almost there, guys. I know it was a whirlwind. It was a very busy year. In May, Mayor Castor announced that she was going to be making changes with the Citizen Review Board. And I just, in the past few months, there have been even more updates that have occurred. So I just wanted to make sure everybody understood exactly how much was occurring here in Tampa. This was not just a one-off event where we had one meeting, made some recommendations, and they fell to the wayside. This was a constant level of engagement. It took a lot of time and energy, both from USF, the police department, the mayor's office, our community members, and I think all of that really shows in the products that we were able to put together. So just so you can understand a little bit about our research methodology that drove these findings, as I mentioned, there was a group of about 40 invited community members and 10 TPD officers, where together we wanted to understand each other's perspectives and come together to be able to identify where the biggest issues we're at and try to put together a plan to address them using evidence-based solutions. We use both qualitative and quantitative data, and that was really essential because we not only saw on a very numerical and objective scale how people in our community were feeling, but we also got to understand more of the why, the emotions, and the narrative that really helped to see the feeling behind those numbers. Since then, as I mentioned, we conducted a citywide survey, and one of my graduate students is going to be doing her PhD looking at changes in our community from April of 2021 until next April of 2022 to see again if there's a measurable difference in how our community is feeling about policing just in that 1 year time frame. So I'm going to briefly overview this. The results in their full fast factor will be presented on TPD's website, so you guys can take a look if you're interested. But these are just some of the themes that we identified from the task force. There was a long-standing distrust of police, and some people said that this lasted, it was passed down generationally, that their parents felt it, now they felt it. So clearly that was something that needed to be addressed. There were concerns over fairness and fear. One police officer actually said, when he's driving and he sees an officer, let's say, behind him, he doesn't have the same level of panic. And having talked to citizens that were on our task force, when he could hear how they felt that fear every time they saw those lights, rather than feeling like an officer was coming to help them, that really helped to characterize what was going on and understand more about the community's perceptions. There's also a strong narrative of obtaining trust in police through action and accountability. And that was one thing that we really tried to represent in our findings and recommendations. Some additional themes, there was a perception that there may be double standards. One community member said that, if he had done something, went to jail, got in trouble at work, he'd be fired or he wouldn't be able to find a job. But he felt really upset that some police officers that get fired for misconduct or leave an agency due to an investigation are then able to get a job at another agency. And he just felt that was very unfair, and I think that was a warranted concern. A call for an increase in accountability and also accessibility. A lot of citizens said, we want to know what the police are doing, and this feeling that perception is reality. And if there's a lot of great things being done at the police department, but the citizens don't know about it, it really didn't make an impact. So being able to have all of the policies, data, and the good stories too, available to citizens, they felt that that was one of the best means of improving police-community relations. Citizens felt that they wanted their officers to be guardians and not warriors. There was a place for being a strong, police officer that was going to fight for them. But more than that, they really wanted someone that they felt that they could trust and understood them, to be a guardian and helper. And that ultimately led to this idea of building relationships, which I thought was so repeated. They really wanted officers that they thought represented themselves and that they knew, they had relationships with, that they could go to with problems and also look to for help. Finally, and I thought these were some of the most relevant in terms of the contemporary discussions on funding of the police and what we're asking police to do. And I can say this as being in former law enforcement, police are asked to do more and more every day, but with limited resources. They're the government agency that we always look to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to help us to solve problems, whether it's, we've had calls, for kids not taking out the garbage, all the way up to homicide. So everything in between. And so police are constantly asked to do too much, and is that warranted? What do we want police to do? And I think that's where the direction of these conversations on policing are going. But one of the more telling things was when, even after all of this, we asked the citizens, do you want police? Do you think that the police should be there? What role do they play? And repeatedly, the vast majority kept saying, if I have a crisis, if something goes wrong, if something happens to my child, my home, I want the police there. I need the police to come, as one citizen said, lickety split. So they felt that they really needed the police, but for all of the reasons that we just mentioned, they wanted there to be a better relationship with the police, and for perhaps the police to not be tasked with doing so much, and for other people who are better served in those roles, such as mental health counselors or social workers, to take on some of that burden away from police. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. This is just some of the numerical data on how citizens felt about the police, and these were citizens that were in the task force. I also conducted a survey of Usf students, and you can see that their numbers are in parentheses on the right-hand side. Just as a comparison, these were members of the task force that I think were representative of some of the prominent groups in our community, some people who had more experience with the police. Usf students are more of our general sample. And so you can just compare on some of these issues how there were a lot of similarity and some there's a big divergence in how they felt. Overall, you can see that there's a need for increasing trust. They wanted an increase in accountability. And there was a real need, I think, to make sure they felt that there was a lack of double standard, that officers receive the same level of accountability that they did if they did something wrong and they got in trouble and ended up, either fired from their job, in trouble, or worst case scenario, going to jail. Additionally, there were some discussions about how people felt when they were interacting with police. As I'm sure my colleague, Dr. Moll, will describe in his presentation, something he said to me even before I conducted this research was that a lot of times citizens feel both over-policed and under-policed at the same time. And these data just really supported that. It felt that citizens thought there were maybe not enough police to help them when they really needed it, but at the same time that the officers were potentially not being as helpful if, let's say, they got pulled over and they felt afraid. So the police presence in their neighborhood, they felt a little bit better than the mean on, but yet there was still a high level of fear. And there was a call for more training and education in police. And overall, I thought that the support for funding and resources in police were greater than what I expected, especially because the narrative at that time was so strongly on defunding of the police. And as I mentioned, there was not a strong call from even our task force members that had some of the more interactions with police. They still felt that there was a need for funding, particularly to go into training and education. So after all of that, 8 weeks later, we were able to come up with findings for 17 different reforms. And I should note that every single one of these was not out of my brain. Every single one was based upon research and evidence that these factors had worked in other agencies around the country. And I did not want to recommend something for my police department. I'm a citizen of Tampa that I knew would not work somewhere else. They've been tested and made sure was going to be effective here in Tampa. So just a few of them, I'm not going to go over all 17 due to time, but you can look at them if you'd like to on the TPD's website. But recommending procedural justice model of policing. And this is not just training, it's a philosophy. And this is something that Dr. Moll is going to talk about in a few minutes. Making sure that all of the policies are available for review online and data on crimes, stops, complaints, uses of force, that all of those are available for citizens as well, so they can see and make their own conclusions about what's going on in our city and police department. Not hiring officers with a history of misconduct. That was a direct response to some of the concerns that we heard citizens say. And expanding the early intervention program for officers that may have a high risk of being problematic, and maybe giving them more training and counseling to make sure that they're not on a path that's going to lead to some of these bad things. Everything with a check mark is already complete. So you can see not only was this a very fast process that we went through all of this and very efficient and meticulous, but they were also very serious about implementing them. And the ones with check marks have already been implemented in the Tampa Police Department. Moving on, there was a call for an increase in building relationships and community-oriented policing, and we addressed that by recommending that there was a more non-enforcement related interactions between law enforcement and the community. So in other words, not going door to door specifically to get intelligence on a case, but really just to build relationships, specifically so the community knew their officers and felt that they could trust them and go to them if they had problems. Changing the evaluation metrics in order to reward and incentivize all of the things that we just mentioned. As I said, I was in law enforcement. I know that officers will do, we'll do. I'm an academic and we do the things that are counted. So we want to make sure that we're counting those great community-oriented policing behaviors and giving officers credit every single time they do something like that. We also wanted to incentivize hiring from our community. And this is not just so we can have more representation from certain groups that are underrepresented, like women, or also members of different minority communities, but also the people that know that area. And now they have relationships that are longstanding and built with their neighbors, and they're bringing all of that to the Tampa Police Department. There is a request to document in policy a philosophy of police restraint, both when engaging with protesters, but also just on every day out in the streets and working with citizens. We also wanted to ensure that the use of force policy documented an emphasis on de-escalation and making sure that that was implemented in our reporting. So every single time an officer utilized some method of de-escalation, we were able to note that and track it and see what types of de-escalation techniques were being used and which are more effective. We also, this is probably one of the bigger things, recommended hiring trained mental health counselors to work with Tampa Police Department to help take some of the burden off and also to respond to some of these calls in a way that they are specifically trained to do. And officers, while they get great training through the academy, that's not their area of expertise. So we recommended that, and that, as I'm sure will be discussed in detail, was one of the bigger reforms and something that was implemented here in Tampa, and I think is, again, an outstanding model, and I think is going to be very impactful on how we see cases get processed down the line. So, almost done, only a few more slides. We did a unique little experiment. This was in April of 2021, and we wanted to ask citizens if you had your choice on these different trainings: procedural justice, crisis intervention training, and de-escalation training. Which of these, would you choose for officers to receive, and how would these impact these different areas that you view police officers on? And these are things like trusting the police, their interactions with police. Did they fear the police? How do they feel about their crime reduction? And I was very surprised to find that even though there's a big call for crisis intervention training, which is officers having a better awareness of how to respond to people who may be in crisis or dealing with a mental health issue, Procedural justice training and de-escalation training were two of the most consistently high rated in terms of perceptions of trust, legitimacy, improving police community relations, and also reducing crime. And I'm very happy to say that while all three either are already implemented here in Tampa or soon will be, de-escalation training, crisis intervention training already have been implemented by the Tampa Police Department. So procedural justice training is the next one on the list, and I know Dr. Moore will talk extensively about that. So if any of this interests you to look at more, you can stay up to date on our task force findings and our updates on our website, which is tampa.gov/taskforce on policing. And you can see each element and also how to access some of the things that I mentioned. And anytime that I'm doing an evaluation and we have an update, it's going to be posted on the website. And finally, as I mentioned, this would not have been possible without all of the community members who took so much time during a pandemic, by the way, to sit and talk with us for hours and hours and hours about how they were feeling. Some of it was very difficult for them to share, and they were so outstanding and willing to do so. I also want to thank Mayor Castor and the City of Tampa for their support in this. She literally said, do what you need to do, and I support you. And every single time I asked for something, she was very supportive and helpful. Chief Dugan and TPD, including Chief Burkhoff, who listened to us, and that's always the best thing as an academic. And of course, the graduate students at the University of South Florida, some of the best in the world, who again took their summer and during a pandemic to work with us and go out there and listen to the community. And every single one who worked with us told us how much it impacted them as well. So thank you everyone for listening, and hopefully that was helpful, and I turn it over to Dr. Moore.
It should be turned over to me.
Yeah, you can start.
Stefan, could you turn it over to me, please?
Dr. Heidi, you're live.
Okay, I am. Great. Thank you. I wanted to just take a few moments and talk to you about Dr. Moore. But first, I want to say, this is our second segment, and it's called Building Trust and Legitimacy. And the question that I have is, how do we do that? And Dr. Fox, I should mention, you gave an excellent summary of your efforts, and on behalf of the community, I thank you for your leadership. So a little bit about Dr. Richard or Rick Moll. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology. He has his PhD in criminology and criminal justice from Arizona State University. He's a prolific scholar, and he's published in very high caliber journals. His main areas of interest or research are theories of crime, technology or the influence of technology on social life, and and aspects of crime and crime control. Now, he's researched many areas, and I'm going to mention those that I think are particularly relevant. One being offender use of the internet, and then also the influence of, perceptions of police and public perceptions of police militarization. Today, Dr. Moore will be answering and focusing on two questions. One is, what is procedural justice? And equally important, is there evidence that procedural justice works? So welcome now to Dr. Richard Moore.
Thank you, Kathleen. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, I'll be talking about elements of procedural justice and legitimacy in the context of police community relations. So about 6 years ago, President Obama convened the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, the first blue ribbon panel of police officers, community members, and academics in over 40 years. And a key element of this task force was talking about the issues facing police community relations today. One of the core elements that the task force identified was building trust and legitimacy. As the task force notes, building trust and nurturing legitimacy is a foundational principle of the relationship between the public and the police. Now, in thinking about this, right, if you go back to the 1960s, and this includes Tampa, the long hot summer of 1967, that the issues facing police and the community go far back. But we'll see these themes repeated again and again and again. One of the biggest ones is this issue of legitimacy. And so when we talk about legitimacy, what do we mean? Generally speaking, we mean that legitimacy of an institution means that people feel that that institution deserves the authority it possesses under the law and that it ought to be obeyed. Now, legitimacy has a lot of positive consequences associated with it. When institutions are viewed as more legitimate, we're more likely to comply with what they ask for. We're more likely to cooperate them. This includes the police. And as Chief Burkhoff, Dr. Fox, and Dr. Heidi have all emphasized, the police rely heavily on the citizenry in order to achieve both public safety and to be effective in the other things that we ask them to do. So where does it come from? Legitimacy, we have a couple elements that shape perceptions of legitimacy, particularly of police. I'm going to go through each of them briefly. So there's procedural justice, effectiveness, lawfulness, and distributive justice. And as you'll see, a lot of these elements echo what Dr. Fox and her task force found in thinking about the issues facing Tampa Bay. Procedural justice, the first element, refers to two things. It's the quality of treatment of citizens. Citizens want to be treated respectfully. They want officers to listen to their side of the story. And it also refers to quality of decision making. Citizens want officers to make decisions based on the facts at hand, and they want to do so in a way that's transparent and fair. Effectiveness. So when we talk about effectiveness in terms of the police, we talk about two main things: preventing crime or deterring crime, and then solving crimes. Right? When citizens don't feel that the police can effectively prevent or solve crimes, they're less likely to cooperate or comply with them in the future. We talk about lawfulness, and lawfulness means that the police are respecting constraints on their authority. So one of the things that Dr. Fox hit on was police respecting First Amendment rights for protesters. When police don't behave in ways that comport with the law or public expectations of their behavior, it undermines the legitimacy that the police possess. And then finally, is this idea of distributive justice. And this refers really to the equitable allocation of resources and services. When Dr. Fox mentioned that some members of the community feel both over-policed and under-policed, it's the idea that when they call the police don't show up, or the police don't care about certain areas or certain communities. And these sentiments undermine the legitimacy of the police. Now, the President's task force identified a number of ways in which police can enhance their legitimacy. Most prominently by improving fair treatment of citizens, being more procedurally just. It also talked about acknowledging past harms, right? So when we talk about the long hot summer of 1967 in Tampa, there were some pretty serious race-related issues in the city between citizens and the police. The task force talks about creating a culture of transparency and accountability, many of the issues that Dr. Fox highlighted a few moments ago. Talked about proactive community engagement, evaluating the impact of crime fighting strategies. So what can the police do better? What are the strategies and interventions that they use that work well? And lastly, the task force talks about diversifying the police workforce, right? That representation matters. Now, as Dr. Heidi said, right, one of the big issues is what do we know about procedural justice and its effects? So for the better part of 50 years, we've studied the relevance of fair treatment for assessments of authorities. And in the past, I would say 30 years, we focused more and more heavily on the relationship between procedural justice and legitimacy in the context of policing. In the past 10 years, we've seen strong experimental evidence that fair treatment cultivates legitimacy, right? That's the best evidence that we can get. Now, a second part of this is how do we create more fair treatment of citizens by police? And so in the past few years, we've seen emerging evidence on the influence of procedural justice training on officer beliefs and behaviors. Now, this evidence is promising, but it's often developed or limited to a single agency, with the best available evidence we have today coming out of Chicago. But really, there are only a handful of procedural justice training evaluations, right? Good science, right? We're here to bring good science to this pressing social issue. And so wanted to share with you all that Dr. Fox was alluding to earlier. So members of CBCS and the Center for Justice Policy and Research are developing evidence-based procedural justice trainings for law enforcement agencies. I'm currently working on this with Dr. Fox, Dr. Verona, and a couple of graduate students, with the goal of helping to promote procedurally just practices within agencies, what we call organizational justice, and to also facilitate better interactions between officers and the public. Now, this is very preliminary. It's an ongoing process because we want to get it right. That's the biggest thing. We want to do this right. So with that, I thank you again for your time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Heidi.
Thank you, Dr. Moll. Very informative discussion, and thank you for your continuing research in this area. Now we turn to our third segment, and that is community policing and crime reduction. And for this segment, we have two speakers. We have USF Assistant Professor Micah Johnson, and we also have Mr. Ray Wong from the City of Tampa's Mayor's Hispanic Advisory Council. I'd like to introduce the speakers one at a time. So we frequently hear the term community policing, and our next speaker will specifically address what is community policing, and then he will talk about strategies that he developed and documented that work with police officers and Black youth to talk to each other, to listen to each other, and equally important, to understand each other. Now, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about Dr. Micah Johnson. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Mental Health, Law, and Policy. He received his PhD from the University of Florida and then did a postdoc fellowship given to him by the National Institute of Health on drug misuse at the University of Florida. His research interests are particularly in the area of behavioral health and health disparities. He's focused on issues such as the effects of childhood psychological trauma, social inequalities, including race and racism, and health disparities among adolescents in the juvenile justice system. Dr. Johnson founded the study of teen opiate misuse and prevention at the University of Florida. Dr. Johnson has received many research grants, particularly in the area of substance abuse and youth. He has many publications. However, one I want to mention in particular, it is a book that he authored in 2021, published in 2021, that is directly relevant to today's discussion. It is called Police Youth Dialogues, a restorative path towards justice. It is my pleasure at this time to welcome Dr. Micah Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you for that very warm and quite impressive introduction. Thank you so much. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some history to set the context for why we have a dialogue process, and just talk about the promises of dialogue and what I've personally seen in this work. So I researched the etiology of treatment of substance misuse among justice-involved adolescents. My efforts in community outreach and translational science puts me on a path of being involved with peace-building activities in the community and efforts to bring law enforcement and youth together as a critical step in engendering peace in a community. In my personal life, I am the kid who was bullied, harassed, and threatened. Once or twice I was assaulted by different law enforcement officers in my community as a young Black male growing up. So I know firsthand why youth all over the world cry out for justice. I know I've seen my family and friends that were harassed or targeted in ways that were not common among our peers who were not Black or didn't come from disadvantage. But I'm also that person who on the worst day of my life as a youth, I sat in the rain with a totaled car that I worked $7 an hour to pay for myself, and hydroplaned and totaled my car. Worst day of my life. It was raining. I was hopeless, and I sat there in the warm embrace of a law enforcement officer. I'm also that person. I've seen the phenomenal capacity for compassion, for professionalism. I sat there being saved by a caring human being, a hero. These personal experiences sort of fuel my perspectives in a way on this work that we do with youth, particularly in relation to their involvement in the criminal justice system. In my 15 years involved in this work, one of the most helpful perspectives comes from a basic intro to sociology course that I took as a freshman. C. Wright Mills, a sociologist, describes this lens as an imagination. All of the complexities of who we are, how we think, how we act, how we dream, how we love, are shaped by these multi-dimensional social factors. Each of us is shaped by biographical experiences, a family background, a position in society, relationships with institutions, schools, governments, and other institutions, law enforcement agencies. We cannot understand ourselves, each other, or the world around us without understanding the biographical and historical factors that influence us in our relationships and our perspectives. So before taking steps towards healing, physicians may ask a patient about their background, their lifestyle, their family history, their current living conditions, their current hurt. Similarly, if we are to truly mend these strained relationships between law enforcement in certain communities, particularly among youth and folks of color, we must take similar steps to understand the historical and the contemporary context by which these relationships have emerged. There are sort of historical and contemporary injustices that contribute to this strained relationship between certain groups and law enforcement entities. Some communities have suffered hardships, brutalities, traumas at the hand of law enforcement officers in particular, or other law enforcement related agents of the government. For example, historians have linked the origins of police patrols to actual slave patrols and lynch mobs. The average police officer may be oblivious to these truths, but this context set the foundation for some of the contemporary issues and distrust that we see. Historical harm has intergenerational effects through diverse mechanisms, including traditions, cultures, practices that perpetuate injustices. For example, as young children, we may learn fear, as young Black children in particularly, we may learn fear and distrust of law enforcement institutions through textbooks, through folklore, through the media, through personal interactions with law enforcement. We may learn them vicariously through rumors or through arrest of people we care about. So these conversations can be very challenging and difficult, and they're further complicated by political polarization, fickle commitments to peace and justice, complex social issues, and sort of superficial investments in building relationships with community members. Many folks lack the tools to have difficult discussions that can be triggering, challenging, or nuanced. We have this history, and some folks in leadership have no interest in addressing or even acknowledging it for various reasons. For me, I think peace is intimately connected to justice, and justice requires some form of truth and accountability, even in the historical context. Many communities have toxic, traumatic, or negative, or just no relationship with law enforcement. The hard truth is that communities themselves have challenges that make life difficult for community members and law enforcement alike. Relationships are difficult, but we need to invest in our relationships with patience, faith, and good intentions. Fortunately, restorative processes are emerging. These processes can be taught, and the skills needed to achieve peace and justice can be developed. There are paradigm shifts occurring throughout law enforcement, throughout institutions in our society and around the world. Community policing was discussed today, but I'll simply sort of define it to make sure we're on one accord using very broad strokes, vague language. It's basically a philosophy of full service policing that focuses on developing relationships. The central goal of policing is relationships with the community, with law enforcement being seen as this vital, very important, almost sacred portion of the community. So dialogue is one of the more fundamental ways in which we can start forging relationships. And there are specific needs for police youth dialogues in particular. And that brings me to the book that was referenced earlier, but really not the book. The book is about the work, and this is not my work, not my program, but I was introduced to this particular program through working with actual police chiefs and law enforcement officers around the world. Throughout history, communities have used dialogues to process, to compromise, to resolve conflict, and to strengthen relationships. Police youth dialogues exist in diverse places around the world. I have colleagues in Ireland that have police youth dialogues. Diverse forms of dialogue are bridging gaps and divides between law enforcement and youth around the world. These programs have common characteristics. Restorative processes are commonplace. Other principles of restorative justice, bonding, building relationships, training, unpacking stereotypes and misconceptions and implicit biases, and most importantly, there are steps to humanize both youth and law enforcement. Highlights of these programs for me include the training on the adolescent brain, implicit biases training on trauma, historical, not historical, but historical context like I provided just a moment ago, but also these hilarious role play exercises when law enforcement pretend to be youth and youth pretend to be law enforcement. It is quite a riot and entertaining. And then all of this sort of, another common theme is for this to kind of end with a fellowship as youth and police officers sit down, share a meal, and bond with one another. It's quite simple, but it's also quite powerful, and we've witnessed magic. These dialogues, we believe, have potential to pay great dividend in regard to community policing, community safety, officer safety, innovative policing, the financial burden of crime and protests, the emotional burden of crime and loss, and long-term public health. The phenomenal power of human connection is on full display in these dialogues. One youth once bonded with his arresting officer, and by the end of that dialogue, they were best buds. And I've never seen any transformation occur that way in that quick of a time. One officer confessed adversities and traumas for the first time that resonated with youth with similar lived experiences. You could hear a pin drop in the room, because no one ever thought that this was a real person who had real life traumas and adversities and issues. Stereotypes are broken down. Some stereotypes are shattered. Relationships are forged. Skepticism becomes hope. Fear becomes trust. Of course, these dialogue programs require further development, tests of effectiveness, as my colleagues mentioned earlier, such as fidelity assessments, evidence testing, and long-term implementation and investments in implementation. Of course, they are young and imperfect, but they have extraordinary potential. I will conclude here with some solutions and recommendations. We must understand the historical and the contemporary issues in order to take necessary steps to heal in a similar way as a physician needs as much data and information as possible to accurately help one feel better or heal from their illness. We must humanize law enforcement officers. We must humanize youth. We must especially humanize youth of color. Communities must invest in dialogue and bonding, not just with law enforcement, but among each other. But I see law enforcement as a critical step towards strengthening communities. Police youth dialogues are, again, a way that we can address public safety, police safety, and all these different ways to empower community members and police officers alike. Diverse coalitions provide the necessary expertise, credibility, and buy-in needed for sustainable implementation of these dialogue programs. Systems of care are also needed to address the complex challenges that communities and law enforcement entities must navigate in their daily lives. But I will conclude with law enforcement entities are critical members of the community, and many of us know that. But they play a critical role in helping folks heal as well from multidimensional social problems. And that's one thing I think law enforcement needs to remember, that they're not just police officers, but they are critical members of community that can play a vital role in strengthening that community and actually helping them heal from the historical and contemporary hurts that they have. And community members are also vital to the effectiveness of policing, to advocate for, to protect, to support, to invest in members of the law enforcement community. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you listening attentively, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I want to thank you in particular for your work with youth, with young people, and then also for your very important research in this area. And now we will go to our next speaker in this section, which deals with community policing, and that person is Mr. Ray Wong. And Mr. Wong actually holds 3 titles. He is a senior healthcare architect, an associate principal, and the healthcare market leader for Baker Barrios Architects. He is a graduate of Leadership Tampa, and he's been very, very active in the community in the Tampa Bay area. In fact, he currently serves on 4 boards. He is on the Hillsborough County Community Action Board. He is also on the City of Tampa Community Advisory Committee, the City of Tampa's Mayor's Hispanic Advisory Council, and he is also on the Advisory Council for the Florida Center for Community Design and Research. Mr. Wong was one of 6 Florida architects in 2020 who was recognized by the American Institute of Architects as a citizen architect for his advocacy work in the community. He was also recognized by the local chapter of the American Institute of Architects with the President's Award, again for his leadership dealing with architecture and the community. So at this time, I would like to welcome Mr. Wong.
Thank you very much. I hope that everybody can hear me. I've been informed that we're running a little bit late and considerably late. And to that end, I think I'm going to jump very quickly to the end of my presentation. We actually have some incredibly brilliant speakers today, and I really feel as though I really want to dedicate as much time to them and what they have to share. I shared with Micah earlier today that it's a bit intimidating to be presenting in front of such a distinguished group, both besides me as panelists, but also in terms of the audience present during today's conversation. I just want to share that I'm not an academic. I don't live in academia, and my role today is to simply represent the layman's perspective. And as a Hispanic Latino, I wanted to kind of share a bit about how that might influence my perception, certainly, but I think what I'm seeing also within the community, specifically as it relates to that segment of the population. I got involved with the task force on policing through my role in the City of Tampa's Mayor's Hispanic Advisory Council, and I was asked about my interest to participate, and I was immediately committed, and more so when I found out that Dr. Fox would be leading some of these efforts, because I knew that her findings related to the effort would be based on sound science and research and data, and I only say that really because I'm an evidence-based design accredited professional and architect, and I certainly can appreciate, and I think my clients appreciate my perspective and decisions that are being made based on science and based on data and based on research. And I think what I've experienced and what I've seen come out of the reports that and a lot of the work that Dr. Fox has led has been exactly that the findings are solidly grounded in those conversations and in that framework. There was a couple of things I wanted to talk about, but I will say that again, we have some incredibly brilliant speakers, and certainly they can speak to the historical perspective and the contemporary perspective in a much greater capacity that I can. So what I'm going to do is really, one second here, I think I'm going to run to the end of this presentation here. Oops, I'm going to back up. So like I said, I want to try to get us back on schedule, and I'm certainly sensitive to everybody's time. So I'll just say again, my perspective, I don't by any means mean to imply that my perspective as a Hispanic and Latino is representative of the perspective of every other Latino in the community. Certainly mine is my own, but I wanted to share what I see today, a little over a year since these conversations started. And my perception is that unfortunately, not much has changed in terms of what we can readily observe. But I say this not to be critical of the process or where we are today. I simply mean that this is not an issue that's going to be solved overnight. And the idea that we're going to quickly see radical change in perceptions and attitudes is just not realistic. And I think to think otherwise is simply not fair to anyone. I think that trust, understandably, continues to be a real issue within the community. And I feel that that too is to be expected. My perception and what I see as I am involved in different committees, involved in the community, my perception is that we continue to do this dance where we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And that too, I feel, is understandable. But I think what I see is that a genuine effort is being made. And I feel as though people understand that within the city of Tampa, that effort is in fact being made. The changes are incremental and in many cases feel incredibly small. And to be honest, I think that that can be very frustrating to many, including myself in some cases. Where are the opportunities? I sort of ask myself, and I think my friends and colleagues and people within the community ask themselves the same question. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities, and I think that's something that we continue to focus on and that we can capitalize on, is that there's a lot of opportunities for informal contacts where law enforcement and communities can come together and build rapport. That shows great potential in building across differences and misgivings between the community and police departments. As I feel as though transparency will continue to be a huge factor in helping to bridge across some of these differences and continue to build trust through increased transparency. Greater oversight continues to be a key consideration, and education of both law enforcement agencies and the general public. That too continues to present us with one of the biggest opportunities to improve relationship between Latino communities and law enforcement in the community at large. I wanted to just end by sharing that it's really interesting hearing Micah sort of share his personal experience with law enforcement, because I too, even as an adult, a professional, educated, living here in South Tampa, I too have had encounters with the police that I've been honest with some friends and have shared those encounters, and some of them don't. It's hard for them to believe. So, but as uncomfortable as some of those encounters have been, I also have had incredible experiences and encounters with folks within the police department. I'll share that. Full disclosure. Assistant Chief Lee Burkhoff and I were members of the same Leadership Tampa class in 2017, and he was an incredible resource then and is to this day, and I think he is the example of what I think of when I think of the good cop, right? So certainly there are those experiences that are negative and help to paint a certain picture within the community, but there are, I would say, by far, much more positive experiences. So again, I wanted to keep it brief because we have some incredible speakers that I want to give the time back to. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Wong, and thank you for all of your service to the Tampa Bay area and for your leadership in so many respects. Now, the last formal presentation we will have is on re-envisioning policing. And this will have 4 presenters, and I will tell you very briefly a little bit about each of them up front and then turn it over to them. Our first speaker is Dr. Kathleen Moore, and she is a research professor in the Department of Mental Health Law and Policy, and she is also the director of the Louis D. LaParte Florida Mental Health Institute. Dr. Moore has her PhD in health and social psychology from Kent State University, and she did a postdoctoral fellowship at Duke University Medical Center. Dr. Moore has published extensively, and she's had millions of dollars awarded to her by the federal government in support of her research. Her area of focus is particularly in the area of substance abuse and mental health, and she is currently involved in several community projects that focus particularly on social policy issues such as co-occurring disorders, homelessness, and jail diversion. Our second speaker is Lieutenant Kurt Royka, and Lieutenant Royka has been with the Tampa Police Department for over 26 years. He is a graduate of St. Leo University, and importantly, he's been in a variety of roles, but I want to just highlight importantly, since 2013, he has served as the manager over the department's School Resource Officers program. He is widely known in the Tampa Police Department and beyond as the expert on juvenile justice, and he actually helped to formulate juvenile justice policy in the 13th Judicial District, or Circuit rather, and that involves Tampa and Hillsborough County. He was assigned in 2020 the very important task of creating the department's first behavioral health unit. And that unit, we're going to learn more about it, is responsible for handling behavioral health related calls for service with the goal of connecting clients with providers. Our third presenter is Tampa Police Department Officer Alexandra Ramos, and she has been involved in law enforcement for well over a decade. She started with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office as a dispatcher. Then she went to the police academy, became a reservist or a reserve deputy, and then a full-time active deputy. She had a variety of roles, including being on the critical response team. She joined the Tampa Police Department in 2015. She's been in a variety of assignments, including serving as an undercover officer with respect to internet crimes against children. Earlier this year, Officer Ramos became the first member of the Tampa Police Department's Behavioral Health Unit. And our fourth and last speaker in this segment is Dr. Thompson. Dr. Thompson is the Behavioral Health Coordinator for TPD's Behavioral Health Unit. She has a PhD in counselor education and supervision, and also a master's in mental health counseling. She's licensed as a mental health counselor in the state of Florida and is a certified trauma specialist. Dr. Thompson has more than 17 years of experience working with children and adolescents and adults in a variety of settings. So it was with pleasure that I introduce all 4 speakers to you and ask Dr. Moore that you please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heidi, and it is an honor to be here this morning with my esteemed group of colleagues. We are going to try to get everything down to about 15-20 minutes. I'm going to just talk briefly and give a brief overview, but really want to hand the baton over to my colleagues to talk about this new unit and to really highlight some of the issues that they've been experiencing and why we decided to do this co-responder unit. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge some of the agencies that we have been working with. In addition to Tampa Police Department, we also have colleagues from Grace Point, Baycare, Crisis Center of Tampa Bay, DACO, Northside, and we are so honored and privileged to have them all working with us, in addition to ACTS as well. So just to kind of set the stage, we all know that mental health and addiction issues are rampant, particularly now with COVID. We've had a steep increase in both and rise in both drug and alcohol issues and mental health issues. We see it on the news almost every day. About 1 in 5 adults experience a mental health condition each year. And we know that about 1 in 20 experience a serious mental health illness throughout their life, right? Such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorders. Within this population, and we consider the term that you may have seen as high utilizers, where they're constantly calls for service, right? Police are going out and really dealing with this population in terms of whatever the mental health issue may be, or whatever the call may be. There's a constant need, and they can talk more about kind of the percentage of calls that they see each day, but a lot of them really deal with issues related to something that really a clinician would be doing, right? And so what's been popping up all over the country is some of these programs that pair a healthcare professional, a treatment provider, with a law enforcement officer. And the goal is to respond to these types of calls through this police mental health collaboration, right? Known as a co-responder team. There's different names, but really that's kind of the gist of what these models are doing throughout the country. And it's a critical tool for law enforcement when responding to people with mental health issues in crisis, with addiction issues, and it really helps have that collaborative team. There's just now starting to be some research in this area. In one study, officers in communities with these co-responder teams are more likely to transport people to mental health treatment programs and resolve incident without arrest than officers in communities that don't have these programs. So what are some of the keys to success with these types of programs? So you want to implement a practical, cost-efficient co-responder model, right? You don't want it to be too complicated. You want to be able to partner with your community-based resources. Having that buy-in from the different agencies is really important. Having that cooperation with your key stakeholders, and those can include your treatment providers, state attorney's office, public defender's office, and other community-based agencies that you're going to be working with on this particular problem. In addition, it's really important before you get started to have cross-training, right? So you want to have law enforcement being trained in issues related to mental health, and likewise, you want to have those mental health professionals that are going to be working with law enforcement trained in law enforcement issues. It's also really important to try to secure funding, right? So now there's some funding that is in particular to this issue on co-responder. And we're going to be looking to try to support this model in the next year or two. And then finally, you want to try to follow best practice, right? So we want to try to follow a model that's implementing best practices for both law enforcement and mental health so that they can work together collaboratively as we move forward. What I'd like to do now is introduce Lieutenant Royka, who is going to talk about some of the program goals and the program structure of this unit.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning, representing Tampa Police Department in our new program. And as we start, we're going to look at some of the program goals. And we established these program goals by looking, number one, at what our needs were. Number two, we looked at it through the lens of what some of our community providers thought would be beneficial for the community as well. And I want to start by saying who our providers were and how they interacted with us. First, we started this program, or developing a program with Dr. Moore and Ms. Claire Reynolds from the Crisis Center, Tampa Bay. We realized very quickly at the police department, we are not the experts in mental health. That is not our forte, to say the least. So we partnered with them and we started looking at how we would best structure this program. We also then decided to partner with the major stakeholders in the county or in the city that would be handling our cases. So we also partnered with DACA, Northside, Grace Point, ACTS. And we came together collectively as a team to put together this program, again, relying on their expertise to guide our processes. So as you see here on the screen, we have some program goals that we have established. And I think these are foundational to how the program is going to be shaped and ran in the future. So the first one, obviously, is just to reduce the number of reduce the recidivism rate on Baker Acts. We know in law enforcement, many times we go out to the same location time and time again for a person that's in crisis. And we have to find a way to reduce that. If we don't, then it's going to lead to unnecessary Baker Acts, potentially unnecessary incarceration. And unfortunately, again, one of our ultimate goals is reduce deadly force encounters. It could lead to that if we end up going out there time and time again, because the person obviously is not getting the treatment they need. And our goal is to reduce that recidivism by getting them connected to appropriate services. We also want to prevent unnecessary incarceration or hospitalization. We realize that a lot of times that the crimes that are committed are related to mental health. And so while we cannot avoid arresting everyone who might have a mental health problem or diagnosis, we can start working towards finding solutions to reduce the overall number of arrests related to mental health. We also want to tear down the silos that exist within the system. I've been involved in juvenile justice for years, and one of the things we noticed very quickly there in that system were their silos. And we had to break those down so we could work across lines and better partner with each other. And I believe that's something we've identified very quickly in our short time of working in this program, is that there's silos within the mental health field as well. And so one of our goals is to reduce those and tear down those silos so we can work across all the different party lines and with all the different groups to better meet the needs of the community. We also, again, our ultimate goal would be to reduce the number of deadly force encounters. That is probably one of the most traumatic things that an officer can ever go through, is to be involved in a police shooting and have someone die as a result of it. And especially when it's a result of mental health. Suicide by cop is a real thing that officers face. We face those regularly across the country on a daily basis. And in Tampa, we've had those happen to us as well. And so we want to reduce that. We want to eliminate that. That would be our ultimate goal, is to reduce those deadly force encounters. Who is some of our target population? Obviously, those experiencing mental health crisis and those who are high utilizers of the system, but we also realize that there's comorbidity between substance abuse and mental health. So while substance abuse is not going to be the focus of our program, we realize that that's going to be a piece of it, and that's why we're also partnering with ACTS and DACO to have those stakeholders involved in that process as well. We have a very lean unit, and here on the screen you can see the structure. We have one lieutenant who's over the program. That's myself. One thing unique to the city of Tampa is we hired a mental health coordinator just for this program to oversee the clinical piece of it. I don't know a thing about clinical work. So the city agreed to hire someone who did know about it. And so I'm so happy to have Dr. Thompson and our staff who's going to oversee that program. And then we're going to have 4 law enforcement officers and 4 licensed clinicians partnering up together to go out and handle these calls for service. And then one other unique piece for the city of Tampa is that we actually have 4 case managers embedded within each one of the major facilities. So at DACO, Grace Point, Northside, NACS, we have a case manager where we can do warm handoffs directly from our clients directly to those receiving facilities, so they can get plugged in as quickly as possible to receive those services that they so desperately need. And then last but not least here for my piece of it would be, how is the program looking? What are some of the day-to-day operations that the officers would be responding to with clinicians? Obviously responding to behavioral health calls. We want the trained professionals going out. For us in law enforcement, we have a very narrow scope when it comes to Baker Act, where clinicians, they have more training, they can do a more in-depth evaluation, determine whether or not the person really needs to be Baker acted, or do we just need to connect them with services from the field. Also, we're going to do follow-ups with the clients. So when a client is Baker Act, or when a client does have an issue or does have a problem, we can assign the officers and the clinician to do a follow-up to keep up with the person, establishing a great rapport with them. Another unique piece for us would be also officer referrals. We know that every call for service that we go to is not mental health related on the front end. But when we go get on scene, a lot of times we see there is a mental health component, but the person doesn't meet the criteria for Baker Act. But so we're setting it up to where the officers can refer to us directly that information, so our team can go out and do follow-ups and try to connect the person to services before Baker Act ever occurs, or before anything else escalates down the line. What is our greatest need? Our greatest need right now are licensed clinicians. We have worked diligently for the past several months doing interviews and trying to locate individuals who'd be willing to come partner with us as a licensed mental health professional. So if anyone knows of any licensed clinicians who would be willing to partner with us, this is a great opportunity to work in the field, to see people daily, to work with one of the best police departments in the nation. And so if anybody out there would like to come be a part of our team as a licensed clinician, we'd love for you to apply, and you can apply through the ACTS website. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Thompson, who's going to give a little bit of overview about what her responsibilities are.
Yeah, it's still there. Hello, everyone. Again, Dr. Kathy Thompson. So my role here with this program is going to be specifically as the behavioral health, the units coordinator. So my lens specifically is from a clinical perspective. However, this is truly innovative in that we are trying to marry the relationship of mental health experts and law enforcement to better serve our community. So some of my responsibilities are listed out in front of you. Again, top priority is probably going to be the subject matter expert. So it will come in my wheelhouse. It will be my responsibility to make sure I'm still connected to the mental health, substance abuse, the clinical side, the different organizations, American Counseling Association, NAMI. So I still need to have that that footprint in with the clinical side. In addition, though, I have also expanded some of my memberships professionally to include those that focus on criminal justice and rehabilitation. Again, trying to truly marry that relationship. So I will be the clinical coordinator liaison between the officers, Tampa Police Department, and the behavioral health providers. Again, it's about attacking those silos, breaking them down, and truly having a collaborative partnership with everyone in the community. That's how our community members are going to best benefit. That's how we will ultimately reduce those calls and those needs for services whenever we appropriately assess them and connect them with the services that they need. Predominantly, I believe I will be doing a lot of oversight and monitoring the clinical activities. Again, at this time, like Lieutenant Royka mentioned, our greatest need is clinicians, so I'm doing a little bit of double duty there, being the clinician. However, I do look forward to getting some very good licensed clinicians in the field so that we can go ahead and do that partnership, do a little bit more supervision and support in that role. A big part of my responsibility will also be data tracking, producing reports. As everyone knows, whenever you need money for a program or you need grants, everyone wants to see that empirical data. So we are going to be tracking those quantitative, what's working, what's not working, and how things are moving in the program. Track and prepare officer referrals. Again, Lieutenant Royka did mention that, he alluded to that. So specifically for my role is, for that purpose, is to be the single point of access. So there is some place to go when officers encounter those individuals who need some sort of a mental health, or maybe just have a little question that they could benefit from the BHU being a part of the, their service. Obviously, in this position, I'm going to have a lot of meetings. So definitely weekly meetings with the unit, but I'm also going to be partnering with providers in the community and with other individuals to make sure that we are up to date, potentially to eliminate or to collaborate on those individuals that we all kind of have contact, cross contact. And lastly, I will be responsible for doing some trainings, obviously mental health perspective, but we're looking to do that with our officers and to have an even greater reach than just the behavioral health unit, to actually go ahead and encompass this mentality throughout the entire department. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Officer Ramos for the perspective from an officer.
Okay, I'm Officer Ramos, and I have been here since day one of the start of the program. I think it's important to touch on our responsibilities as officers to our community. I think we have to be empathetic. We have to be able to put on a different lens when we respond to calls. With this unit in particular, we're going to be able to provide a more compassionate intervention and assist with care coordination. When I respond to just any call for service, I try to put myself in their shoes, and I try to let them know, you know, I may not be in your situation, I may have never been in your situation, but let me use, you know, my position to help you as best I can. I think with this program, it's going to be great that individuals experiencing a crisis are going to be able to see a different side of law enforcement, a more softer side maybe. Our uniforms are going to be different than a regular patrol officer. We're going to be wearing polos and tactical pants. So it won't be just like a regular uniformed officer responding with that, you know, that look to their residents or to wherever they are. I think part of that is we're going to be able to build rapport with those individuals experiencing crisis. And as Lieutenant Royka mentioned, reducing recidivism is very important. So I think people experiencing crisis multiple times, they may be more apt to just call the behavioral health unit instead of, you know, calling law enforcement directly, activating 911. Another big benefit to this program is going to be an officer like myself and my clinician. We're going to be able to take quality time with specific individuals. So we don't have, I'm not going to be tied to a radio. I have to go respond to a different call. I can take my time, make sure they're connected to the services that they need to be connected to. I think a big issue with mental health and behavioral health, there's the situations that law enforcement has responded to in the past. I know we've talked about police, you know, suicide by cop, that happens. So I think a big issue with these calls is they're unpredictable, they're volatile. So it's important that an officer is responding with a clinician to these calls because of they're volatile and they can change directions very quickly. So we're not going to be able to take law enforcement out of these situations, but we're going to be able to provide a safe environment for a clinician and the subject that we're dealing with. The behavioral health unit officers are going to be a resource to our regular patrol officers. They have officers on the street have our cell phone numbers. They can call us if they're on the fence about something, you know, if they have a question about a specific service, or if there is service for, you know, an individual they're dealing with. So they can call us at any time and ask specific questions about anything that they're dealing with on a call. And we can put them in touch with resources that maybe a law enforcement officer doesn't know about. I think that was before I came to this unit. I was just regular patrol officer. So there are things that I'm learning now through dealing with Grace Point and DACO and ACTS in Northside Mental Health that I didn't know about as a regular patrol officer. So I think it's going to be really beneficial for our street officers to have the BHU as a resource to them. So, and with that, I will close and I'll turn it back over to somebody else.
Thank you, Officer Ramos, and thank you for all of my colleagues at the Tampa Police Department. I am really looking forward to having this opportunity, this unit to roll out, and look forward to future collaborations with them. I also, again, want to pitch what Lieutenant Royka did earlier, is that we're still looking to hire several licensed clinicians. So again, I think it's a wonderful opportunity for those that are really interested in that intersection between criminal justice, law enforcement, and mental health. So please consider that if you have those credentials. I would now like to turn it over to Brianna, who is going to be leading the Q&A.
Okay, hi everybody. Hopefully you can see me. So we got quite a few great questions already, and thank you again for sticking with us and putting forth these great questions. So one of the first questions that we had was actually posed to Dr. Johnson, and the question was, with various things that have occurred in your life and that you've seen throughout history and around the world, are you optimistic that real change is possible? And can we achieve an anti-racist society?
I'm extraordinarily optimistic for many of the reasons that we've discussed today. We have witnessed a tremendous amount of progress and sort of awakening, in a way, unprecedented in the past couple years. Some folks didn't think they would see these types of things happen in their lifetimes. So while I am really sort of aware of the challenges that we face and the difficulties, I am tremendously optimistic. I've seen things in law enforcement that were extraordinary. I've seen relationships forged. I've seen programs implemented in a real way with real support from leadership. So I'm tremendously optimistic, and I do believe that an anti-racist sort of society is possible, or a society where we've been able to make these things less common, or these incidents less common in people's lives. I do realize that's really difficult, but I do think it's possible. And we have great people at the helm pushing things forward. So yes, I'm optimistic, and I do believe that one day we will reach a place of sustainable peace.
I agree with you for what that's worth, and I think that this is all the necessary things we have to do to make everything that you just said possible. So a few more questions. Somebody anonymous wrote, I wanted to know if there's a plan to address how law enforcement interacts with individuals on the spectrum to keep this community safe, especially those individuals of color. I think this is an outstanding question because as we're focusing more on mental health issues and substance use, there's also a question about people who have autistic and Asperger's syndrome, things like that, are on the spectrum. So I'm gonna actually direct that to Dr. Moore and Dr. Thompson because I think they're best suited to answer that.
Thank you, Brianna. Thanks, Brianna. I'm going to have Dr. Thompson talk a little bit about that topic.
Thanks for the question. It's actually a very valid and good question. So autism and those on the spectrum actually hit me personally. I have worked with individuals on the spectrum. So one of my first things as soon as I got on the behavioral health unit was to reach out to those resources for autism. So currently we are working with a couple of different agencies to try and get a relationship built. And specifically, I know we are working on a way to communicate, like a communication card for those. But I believe your question is tailored more toward our actual interaction, our physical behaviors. So with that information and through that relationship that we're building, the plan and the idea is to go ahead and have them implement some one-on-one training with our officers and with our clinicians. Not all clinicians are familiar with working with those with autism or those individuals, but it's definitely going to be on our radar. It is a training that is going to be implemented as soon as we get that finalized. Again, it's not something we're ignoring. It's just something we haven't quite finalized to go ahead and offer that training, but it is on our radar.
Fantastic. And I know that there's actually a lot of research being done on this, on how we can identify these different issues and implement it into, let's say, crisis intervention training in order to make law enforcement more aware and respond better, particularly when we're dealing with co-response models too. Another question for both Dr. Moore and Dr. Thompson. How do mental health practitioners and law enforcement manage patient confidentiality? And I can also say that I've dealt with this from a research standpoint because we are collecting information in the jail on risk factors and things, needs that people may have, and we're trying to do it to help, but then we have to share it with law enforcement or in order to be able to provide the resources and support, like through a behavioral health unit. So it gets tricky. So I'd love to hear also how you guys handle it.
Absolutely. That is definitely probably one of the top 3 things that Lieutenant Royka and I have on our agenda. So we have been in the works for probably several months now, not just a few months, with creating a release of information. And so we're very specific to try and tailor that to ensure that we are protecting the PHI, the confidentiality of those individuals, but at the same time getting enough information so that we can appropriately connect them to the resources that they need. Specifically, we are working on creating our own database for the behavioral health unit so that we are clinically HIPAA compliant, again, protecting confidentiality, de-identifying our individuals for that confidentiality piece, and then for our unit specifically to make sure no one else has access to exactly what we're doing with our clientele. But again, I guess the message now, right now, the plan is everything clinically is stored outside of a law enforcement database, and everything law enforcement is stored and kept outside of a clinical database. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that was a great answer, and I know it's very tricky from my own personal experience dealing with this as well. So I think we only have time for one more question, and there's so many, so I apologize to everybody that submitted a question and we didn't get to here, but I'll try to take any ones I can offline. So Celia Lascano asked, might this potentially be a field experience opportunity for our students? And the reason why I wanted to pick that question is the answer, I think, is yes. I think there's so many different opportunities. I'm going to highlight 3 since they address their questions that have been raised by participants. Number 1, I think there's an opportunity for field experience if you have a student that wants to go into forensic or behavioral health and wants to work potentially with the co-response unit. They're looking to hire, as we've heard, and I think that there's a need for getting clinical hours and experience, so I think that's one avenue that we can potentially pursue. Another is getting our USF students involved with law enforcement. One thing I mentioned was hiring from within our community, and we're looking specifically with my center on how we can provide scholarships for students that are here at USF and want to go into law enforcement and be able to provide the funding source that they need, that they may not have had the opportunity to do so, but be able to get that experience and then take all the knowledge that we here at USF are giving them and make law enforcement better from within. And then the third one, which is I guess a little bit of a self-plug, which is they can apply to be part of any of the research projects that are going on with the CJRP. And it's not just my own. We have faculty from across USF and from public health, medicine, sociology, psychology, and of course criminology that are all collaborating on projects related to any type of criminal justice issues. And if students want to get involved, there's so many opportunities, and faculty would be absolutely delighted to work with them. So our website is usf.edu/CJRP, and I'm sure Dr. Moore, Dr. Thompson would also be very willing to take any questions about how to get students involved with the co-response model. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Heidi. I don't believe we have time for any more questions, but if we do, I'd be happy to answer more.
Thank you, Dr. Fox, and thank you to the audience. I'd like to close by thanking all the speakers for taking the time to share their expertise and their findings. And then in addition, I'd like to thank the audience for also making the time to participate. And I'd like to just close with the words of former President John F. Kennedy. And what he said, I think, really applies. There are risks and costs to action, but they are far less than the long-range risks of comfortable inaction. So I think our speakers really told us about the action steps we're taking, and that the mayor is, and the chief of police. And on behalf of USF and the larger community, I want to say thank you to the Tampa leadership as well as to the speakers. And that will conclude our program. Thank you. Dr. Fox, you said you would stay on for a few minutes. I think we've lost Dr. Fox. She's having some technical issues. So Dr. Moore, are you available to stay on? Okay, and I will as well, and any other speakers that want to stay on for a few minutes in case there are others that have questions, and I can pull up the questions and see if we still have some, or maybe just, oh, we can't do open mic here. There's a question here, and this might be a good question for Lieutenant Royka. Are the data on police interactions broken down by race and ethnicity? Here's Dr. Royka right now.
Yes, we collect our data, and we're able to look at all of our data by race and ethnicity, and we can break it down. We can break down the range, however we need to. It is available.
Okay, very good, thank you. And this is from one of our distinguished alumni, Manuel Jacques, and I'm just reading, just reading it. He's saying, a first great presentation, appreciates and recognizes the efforts put into the event. My comment is this, as the intake supervisor with the Florida Department of Corrections here in Tampa, we supervise all of those placed onto felony supervision. If we can assist in any way, please let me know. The ongoing interaction with those being supervised and our fellow stakeholders are crucial, and together we can assist in making a positive difference in our community. So that is from Manley Jacques, and there's a question here, anonymous, that says, how about improving hiring practices and criteria? I think some of that's been done. I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that. I'll start, and then maybe Lieutenant Royka. What comes to mind now for me is that the policy have changed, in particular to reaching out to diverse communities, and then also at one time there was a reluctance to hire people with tattoos. I believe that has been not as much of an issue. And then also with respect to drug use, there was a time that use of marijuana was disqualifying. And I wonder, Lieutenant Royka, if you could update us on anything that is, in addition, a change that improves hiring practices and criteria, makes them more accessible to our community.
Yes, so we have revised our tattoo policy. Tattoos are allowed. Obviously, there's some restrictions still applied to it, such as anything profane and vulgar. Those would be allowed. And then also for drug history, we do have a drug use policy. There has to be a separation from it for a certain period of time before a person can be a candidate to be hired. But we do recognize some of the societal challenges, and we've made changes to better accommodate the community. And if I could circle back to the last one that you just read from the Department of Corrections, gentlemen, one thing that we've done in Hillsborough County that really Tampa spearheaded was a regional meeting with all of our law enforcement stakeholders on a regular basis. My client today is going to be the sheriff's office client tomorrow. So we meet on a quarterly basis where we just talk through some of the issues that we're experiencing. And so for DOC, if you'd like to be a part of that, please reach out to me at Tampa Police Department and we'll get you connected, sir.
Thank you, Lieutenant Royka. And I think this is likely the last question. If the caller is still on, they would appreciate, I'm sure, having it answered. The respondent is asking, is the dialogue between police and the community ongoing, and how can the community members become involved in the conversation? So I don't know that Dr. Fox can take that question. Dr. Moore or Dr. Johnson, do you feel that you could take that question? No, okay.
I have Chief Burkhoff.
Can you address that, Lieutenant Royka?
Chief Burkhoff can, and he's sitting right
here. I didn't realize he was still on the call. Great, that's perfect.
I'm a dedicated USF alumni. I'm not.
Yes, you are. And Chief, thank you for being here with as busy as you are. So how can members get involved in the community at this point, if they'd like to in the conversation?
Great question, and it's a perfect timing because next week is our national night outs for our 3 districts, so Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. If you go to our website, tampa.gov, and go to police, you'll see those there. And then also on Friday at Armature Works, with our Faith in Blue, and a big event. We've advertised that on our social media. Bring your lawn chair. We have a DJ, and those 4 functions just next week are great opportunities to interact with us. So I would encourage anybody to come to any one of those. So 4 events just next week. Tampa.gov/police.
Thank you very much, Chief. And our final comments will be made by Dr. Kathleen Moore, Director of Florida Mental Health Institute. Dr. Moore.
Thank you, Dr. Heidi. Again, I apologize for going a little bit over time, but this is such an important topic and important issues that we've been addressing this morning. I want to thank all of you for attending this morning's colloquium. I also want to deeply thank all of our presenters in our colloquium this year. It has been an honor and a privilege to work with all of you, both of our academic colleagues taking the time out, as well as our community partners. In particular, I want to thank my friends at the Tampa Police Department for taking part in this colloquium and continuing to work with us collaboratively on these very important community and policing issues. I think we're just starting to skim the issue, and so there's a lot of other issues that we need to address. And I think by working together, I think we're hopefully going to try to get at the heart of these in the coming months, in the coming years, right? It's going to take a long time. We look forward to this ongoing collaboration, and we are so glad that you took the time out of your busy schedule, all of you, attendees and partners that presented with us to take part in this colloquium. Have a wonderful day, have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.